Hello and welcome, all you friendly people, to Rock and Roll Town. This is Jay Smith. I am about to throw my very first episode of the history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll at you, the probably undeserving public, the unknowing public, the unthinking public. I kid. I know you're wonderful people, and you love music just like me. I'm not an expert. I'm a lover of rock and roll. So I just wanted to stop in at the beginning of this to say there's going to be a couple other moments where this voice comes in from the future and makes a little note or gives you a little break in the action. The first note I want to give you is to call attention to a mistake I made while recording the audio. I have been doing a lot of research not only on Jerry Lee Lewis, but Elvis Presley and CBGB's and the Seattle rock scene from the 90s and the 80s at the same time. And while I had my head in all these books, I misremembered one specific detail about Jerry Lee Lewis's life, and that is going to come up, I believe, in this episode. If not this episode, the next one. So if you hear me referring to his cousin, who became a preacher on television, as Jerry Lee Falwell or Jerry Falwell, that is incorrect. It is actually Jimmy Swaggart. As a youth growing up in the 80s, both those gentlemen, both their identities occupied the exact same space in my mind. They were well-known, over-the-top characters on television that were at various times accused of bilking millions of people out of a lot of money. In the name of Jesus. Anyways, when you hear me say Falwell, please think Jimmy Swaggart instead. And we will proceed with that. I'll make another sort of note about that to the audience on the second episode, just to cover my bases and not slander the wrong charlatan. Anyway, here we go.
All right. Welcome, all you rock and roll pyromancers and no-good-nicks and vandals and ne'er-do-wells, plasmatics, motorheads, other sorts of trash, well-meaning though you are. This is the Jerry Lee Lewis Great Balls of Fire edition of the history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. This movie can be best described as the opposite of a fried egg sandwich with bacon, chili sauce, and chutney on white bread. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll tell you. I'll tell you later, after we talk more about Jerry Lee Lewis and the inner workings of this movie. Now, this movie comes at the end of the 80s, and thus the end of the 80s nostalgia boom for the 50s, which I tend to think of as being bookended by this film at the end. And at the other end, you would find the Buddy Holly story starring Gary Busey. And in the middle, you've got Eddie and the Cruisers, which is about a fictional band, and La Bamba, about Richie Valens. I can only assume that 50s nostalgia was so rampant in the entertainment industry in the 1980s because the folks making the decisions about entertainment had probably grown up listening to rock and roll music that had a profound impact on them, and they wanted to, show it to younger generations and preserve it for their own generation. Tribute it, I suppose. It was also at this time that there were a ton of books starting to come out, tell-all memoirs. People that used to be in love with Elvis or cook for Elvis or knew the family of Elvis, that kind of thing. Tons of front page stories in the supermarket, grocery store, tabloid publications about Elvis Presley being sighted somewhere. So it was around this time that Jerry Lee Lewis's third wife, Myra Gale, his second cousin, who was only 13 at the time they were married, published her own memoir titled Great Balls of Fire, The Uncensored Story of Jerry Lee Lewis in 1982. This was sold off for film rights, totaling $115,000, plus a share of the profits of the film when it came out. Evidently, Jerry Lee Lewis hated this film, which is strange because he was heavily involved in it with re-recording his own songs for the soundtrack and arguing about how many of the songs he should be able to perform for the soundtrack, as well as, how much involvement the actor Dennis Quaid was going to have, as well as how much involvement the stunt actor that was going to perform the piano moves for Dennis Quaid was going to have, although Dennis Quaid did a little bit of the piano playing that you do see on screen. But mostly he hated Myra's book, of course. That stands to reason. I didn't read it, but I can probably assume that would be the case for most divorcees a couple of decades later. Anyways, Myra ended up leaving him and marrying the private investigator that she hired to keep track of all his philandering and lying and cheating and whatever. So, I'm sure the book was not all that complimentary, especially from the point of view of a girl of 12, 13, when she was falling in love with someone as wild and crazy and probably very controlling and patriarchal as Jerry Lee Lewis. Funny thing, though, apparently Myra didn't like the movie either. Apparently it was too phony for her taste, but the director Jim McBride said that he didn't really have a big priority when it came to tying the film to the facts. Quote, "This movie does not represent itself in any way to be a historical documentary. We use the book as a jumping off point," unquote. But I have to say that the director missed a huge opportunity here in the creation of this movie. There's so much quality in every aspect of the making of the film and the presentation, except for the editing, the pacing, the point of view of the film. You're left totally, thoroughly confused as to what the point of view of the film is really supposed to be. All the ingredients are right, and the composition is all wrong, which isn't to say that it is really inaccurate. I don't think historically it is guilty of being inaccurate. From what I've read in Nick Toshi's amazing book Hellfire about Jerry Lee Lewis, from what I've read in his book Country, The Twisted Roots of Rock and Roll, and what I've read in the great big old 2-volume set of Elvis biographies, Last Train to Memphis and Careless Love, written by Peter Guralnick, who will factor in to another episode for sure. I didn't see anything taking place in this movie that was fabricated or a stretch of the truth, with the exception of maybe the big, huge setting the piano on fire scene. There's no photos of this. There's no eyewitness accounts that I've read that weren't supposedly just Jerry Lee Lewis. I don't know that Chuck Berry's ever talked about it. We can, get into the nuts and bolts of the scene. It's sort of a pivotal moment in the performance career of Jerry Lee in this film. And, being a smart, business savvy man, Chuck Berry had an ironclad contract saying he was the headliner whenever he played at that time. He had a lot of hits, and he wasn't going to be supporting act for anybody. So Jerry Lee gets angry that he's not the closer, goes out, burns down the piano. Supposedly, he had a Coca-Cola bottle with some Coke mixed with gasoline, and he doused the piano, and he threw a match in there, and he played the rest of his song until the whole thing burned down. There are conflicting reports as to whether or not he has stuck with that story. People have said that he has admitted it was totally fabricated, totally made up. He never did that. Other folks say that it was totally true and their dad was there, but didn't take any pictures, or couldn't be reached for comment or whatever. But it's kind of one of those things, I guess, to leave it to Reddit and the comments threads to yell at each other about. It's strange, though, he walks off stage and says to Chuck Berry, "Follow that, killer." And that was Jerry Lee's nickname, although I don't think the killer nickname is mentioned in this movie once. It is in Walk the Line when he walks off stage in front of Johnny Cash and says, "Good luck, nobody follows the killer." The main other inaccuracy in this film, the only other one that I could really notice or reference or disprove, is the fabricated sort of deep-seated resentment between Jerry Lee and Elvis. It starts out with Jerry Lee sort of smoldering with jealousy when Elvis shows up at Sun Records and has a bunch of girls around and is signing autographs. But in reality, by the time Elvis did sort of pop in at Sun Records on that day Jerry Lee was there and they met for the first time, it was sort of cozy and intimate enough for him to just get to know Jerry Lee and Carl Perkins, who was there, and start playing hymns and gospel songs on the piano and fooling around with old-timey tunes that they all knew. And as Jerry Lee said in an interview, they knew the same church songs, and they sang all the same songs. They were both highly admired by all the people that worked with them in a musical capacity, both men, for being just an encyclopedia of songs in various genres: rhythm and blues, country music, gospel music, other forms of sacred music and spirituals.
Hello, folks. This is Jay from the future, stopping the program for a second, just to come in really quickly and say, this is my first episode. I was working with a lot of different technical stuff and hadn't quite figured out the format that I'm going to be using going forward. I'm saying that at this time because it's a nice break in the action to perk your ears up with a different sound. So, thank you for being here this whole time so far. I'm still learning how to do this. Sometimes my delivery gets a little bit stumbly, and that's going to happen a little bit more later on. And I thank you for powering through it all with me. I promise this is going to get better. I'm not making excuses. I'm not saying it's not good, but it's going to get better. And I'm going to finish out this section and move on to more about the movie, Jerry Lee Lewis, the people around him, the actors, and some great Jerry Lee Lewis stories from real life as we get into part 2, the next episode. Anyways, here we go. Back to me in the past.
So while Elvis is there, having just met Jerry Lee for the first time in real life, Sam Phillips, the man who runs Sun Records and is busy trying to make them all rich and famous, goes and calls his newest signee, Johnny Cash, and says, you should come down here and check out what these boys are doing. This whole time, he's got the tape recording, and Johnny Cash shows up, and he joins in. They all start singing songs together, and someone takes a photograph. Eventually, that becomes the famous $1 Million Quartet photograph. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's something to behold. Was eventually turned into like a Broadway show, I guess, that ran for a few years and was pretty successful. But I've never seen it, so I'll keep talking about this movie, which I have seen. Now, there's a scene later where it shows Elvis all cranky and grumpy, and he's wearing his uniform and ready to go off to Korea, and he tells Jerry Lee that he can just have it. He can take it all. And, like he's just giving up rock and roll for Jerry Lee, which I don't believe that ever happened. Also, it shows him laying on a bed with some hot gal in a I think it was in a negligee or a nightie of some kind, and watching Jerry Lee Lewis on the Steve Allen show, having a great old time. And they just show him smoldering and angry about it. Which they could have used that opportunity to make a comment on the fact that Steve Allen had shown himself to be very, very out of touch with the young audience when he brought Elvis on his program and made him wear a tuxedo and tails and a top hat and sing "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog" to an actual hound dog. He showed everyone that, that was the only way he was going to let Elvis on his show and make a mockery out of him and make it uncomfortable for everybody involved. He also would go on TV and just read out of context rock and roll lyrics like Gene Vincent, "Beep-bop-a-lula, she's my baby. Beep-bop-a-lula, she's my baby." Things like that, just to basically just say, isn't this world-changing, life-altering music that all of our kids love, that we resent, just the silliest thing in the world? Why won't it go away? Anyways, I guess he must have changed his tune, or he just really liked Jerry Lee Lewis, because by the time Jerry Lee came on, he was a little more enthusiastic about letting the artists do their own thing. And the depiction of the performance is pretty true to what you can see on footage if you go do a search for it. Jerry Lee does stand up and kick back of the piano stool, which is then thrown back across the stage by Steve Allen, and a couple of other things too. I think he just kept throwing things because he thought it was funny. So anyways, back to what I was saying about the $1 Million Quartet eventually becoming a Broadway play musical. I think one of the conflicting intentions of this film was maybe someone was vying for it to become a musical and play on Broadway, because there are multiple scenes that, out of the blue, just have people jumping and dancing around to Jerry Lee Lewis music. There's one, especially the one with High School Confidential in the early to middle part of his rising to stardom section of the story. He goes to pick up Myra at high school, and High School Confidential is playing in his car, supposedly, but then when he pulls up to the school, everyone else can hear the music and comes out of the school as the bell rings and start dancing, and he's like singing in real time, and everyone's just so excited that Jerry Lee's there. And there's at least one or two other moments like that in the film where it just jumps into musical territory uncomfortably, because it's not set up as a musical in any other way. There's no expository dialogue being communicated musically. There's no emotional conflict between characters communicated musically at all, anything like that. So I would say that aspect of it is half-assed, but it's actually a third-assed. There's three asses to this film that you would think could come together to make one beautiful ass, but no, it was third-assed all the way through. The other two parts of the assing are not telling Myra's story from her perspective the whole time, and not capturing the confusion, not capturing her fear, not capturing her plight, or not even capturing her sort of determination to defend Jerry Lee when he comes under fire. The third unacid part is it's not a great story of a musician being a musician. It's more of a story of a sort of loose cannon being a loose cannon. They don't get into the composition of songs or a lot of sort of eureka moments of recording particular tunes, or the kind of things that explain how Jerry Lee got to be so brilliant and such a crazy performer, other than, seeing him sneaking out as a little kid to watch people playing in a juke joint down the street from where he and his closest cousin, Jerry Lee Falwell, that'll come up in a minute, were growing up. So, to tie this part up in a little bow, it's not a great rock bio, it's not a musical, and it's not a great biography of Myra Gale either. Because of this, it is the opposite of a fried egg sandwich with bacon and chili sauce and chutney on white bread. Now, as all of you know who have grown up watching the British science fiction comedy Red Dwarf, which I assume accounts for myself and one other person listening someday, there was a very famous drunken rant from one character to another when he's lecturing him about how wrong he is about everything. All the parts of him are wrong, but somehow when you put this slobby, late, rude, obnoxious person all together as a person, people really like him. And where he, who should be the guy everyone loves, is organized and determined and yada, 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 is despised by everyone because he's a real prick and he doesn't really understand that. And this all revolves around the revelation that of the first time he's eaten a fried egg, chili sauce, and chutney sandwich with bacon on it. He says, all the ingredients in this sandwich are wrong. They're just like you. But put them together, and it's something wonderful. The movie Great Balls of Fire, with Dennis Quaid and directed by Jim McBride, has the right ingredients, and you put them all together, and you get nothing. You get a whole lot of non-commitment. But it is filled with excellent direction, excellent performances, great costuming. The storytelling, as non-committal as it is, does a pretty good job, and it is worth a watch if you're into rock and roll, and if you're just sort of you want to catch a good late '80s movie, even though this is kind of hard to find in a lot of places. There's some real gems in here when it comes to the viewing experience, not least of which is the makeup of Jerry Lee's backing band. Backing band led by his cousin and the father of Myra Gale, J.W. Brown, who is performed exceptionally well by the founding member and leader of the band X, Mr. John Doe. His lead guitarist, played by older brother of Stevie Ray Vaughan and founder of the Fabulous Thunderbirds, Jimmy Vaughn. And those Thunderbirds de Fabuloso must have had some sort of connections, or their agent must have had some connections in Hollywood, because around about the same time, the Fabulous Thunderbirds, this being the only reason I know who they are, had a song that was featured very heavily in a Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas, that's who it was, a picture called Tough Enough, about two ex-convict bank robbers that decide to go on one last heist, but they rob a train, I think, instead. Anyways, that song Tough Enough was obviously the title song for the film, and it was featured in all the trailers, it was featured on the credits, and, well, I hope they made a lot of money. And then their drummer is portrayed by none other than Mojo Nixon. And if you don't have Mojo Nixon, then your store could use some fixin', as I believe the Dead Milkman said. Seriously, if you've never heard of Mojo Nixon, you're probably most people. But get your ass over to whatever streaming services control how you are allowed to hear music nowadays, or the YouTubes, and look up Elvis is Everywhere by Mojo Nixon. I will wait until you come back to continue.
Hey, it's me again, Future Jay from the future. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives. Spoke once the great prophet Criswell. I'm jumping in again to put off my past self a little bit, to give him time to rest and breathe, as he has given you time to go listen to Mojo Nixon. How about that fried egg chili chutney sandwich reference from Red Dwarf, huh? Yeah, well, not my fault if your mind doesn't operate on the same high level as mine. What do you want for nothing, Siskel and Ebert? This is not the Chicago Sun-Times. That cost at least 25 cents, I believe, in 1989, and you're getting this for free. Those two fuddy-duddies didn't even understand what made Reservoir Dogs great. What do they know about movies anyway? Actually, I should look up what they did say about Great Balls of Fire, if it's available.
Now, a couple things about the band aspect of the movie I wanted to touch on for sure. This movie is one of the greatest offenders I've probably ever seen. That's offenders, not defenders. Of the live band strikes up a song and instantly sounds like the recording. And even though supposedly these songs were re-recorded by Jerry Lee Lewis, this is right up there with, I'm sorry to say, one of my favorite movies ever, Eddie and the Cruisers, with the actors singing lead just really not matching up with what you're hearing coming through your speakers. And it's not a timing thing. It's just an overdoing it sort of acting thing. Like by comparison, the Jim Morrison stuff in the Doors movie that Oliver Stone directed, Val Kilmer did an amazing job, I think, of portraying Jim and his body language and how he expressed himself and how he looked when he sang. It's just that he was a terrible singer. He's an actor. I'm not talking about Jim. A lot of people will say Jim Morrison was a terrible singer too. I can't beat them in court on that. I love the Doors though. So to me, Jim's a great singer. I'm not that great. But the sort of live rock scenes in bars and large theaters and on TV and stuff that they have in this movie don't come off super exciting or energetic or live at all, really. So I guess when I complimented all the actors playing the musicians, because they're all actually musicians, I'm complimenting them in their performance. I truly do mean that. I truly do mean to give them all the accolades as, musicians playing actors could receive in a movie in the late 80s. But the overall effect with Dennis Quaid just isn't quite there. And he's trying his hardest to kick ass, and he's kicking ass. It may be something about the way it was filmed. I don't want to blame him. I know he must have worked really hard on it, but I think it might be down to the sound editing. But a positive I want to highlight in this movie when it comes to the band and the live show atmosphere comes from this sort of roadhouse gig they do about a third of the way through the film. And they have a bit of an argument on stage, and the bassist suggests they do a whole lot of shaking going on. And Mojo Nixon, as the drummer, has to be the guy to say, hey, this is an all-white audience, that music is too much like the stuff we're not supposed to play, using the N-word to describe the music. This comes up in the Buddy Holly story, too, when people running a very expensive recording session, say, of Buddy's drummer from the Crickets, we've got the best talented musicians and professionals that you could ever want, and you want a guy that plays like an N-word on your track instead. It was a real sentiment among the public and music professionals that players had to sort of contend with at that time. Radio was still segregated. The reason rock and roll was so explosive was because black people were supposed to listen to R&B radio, white people were supposed to listen to hillbilly and country radio in America, and never the twain should meet. And what was happening at this time in the 50s is Elvis was the breakthrough white artist to bring what was honestly called Negro rhythms in a polite form, in print is what they would call it, to white America, as well as sort of more hillbilly country sounds to a black audience that also enjoyed the rocking rhythm and liked to dance. But it's natural that there would be some fear and trepidation on behalf of musicians debuting this live in front of a raucous all-white crowd for the first time. But it's a fun scene when they do a whole lot of shaking. You can probably find it on the YouTubes. And it essentially has a dance floor scene where everything in the song is acted out on the dance floor. Not quite as if it was a musical, but with Jerry Lee giving commands like he does in the middle of the song to a particular dancer that people gather around. And it's a nice sort of transformative, it's a great winning a crowd back sort of a scene, or commanding a crowd, having an artist being so forceful and energetic and impossible to ignore that they win. And what musician or performer doesn't want to live out their fantasies vicariously through a scene like that? Now, I think we're nearing about half an hour's worth of audio here. And for my first time, I think I want to take a break and give you time to get on with your day, or zip ahead to part 2, if that's available at this time, on your podcast programmic player device. But in the next part, we're going to talk specifically more about Dennis Quaid's performance, Winona Ryder's performance, which I haven't touched on yet. The only actor I do want to mention here before I forget to is good old Stephen Tobolowsky. Ned Ryerson from Groundhog Day is Jerry Lee's manager in this. Does a great job. These biopics always have really fun character actors as the manager of the artist. I always love seeing that. When we get to Elvis, we'll talk about the mayor of Gotham City, who was Colonel Tom Parker. And if I can be completely fair and honest and transparent here, I think I want to stop now, because before I get on too much of a roll, I want to reevaluate some audio settings on my equipment that I want to adjust for maximum telephonic efficiency. So for now, everyone, please be nice to yourselves. Be good to the people around you. Listen to music, sing songs very loud, make lots of noise with musical instruments if you can. Remember that rock and roll is a gift that we were all blessed with, and we should all be thankful and take care of, and do our best to preserve it as we can and help it grow for others in the future.
Future events such as these will affect you in the future. Again, that was Criswell, but stay tuned, because we're going to, in the next episode, get into very exciting stories of encounters with Jerry Lee Lewis, involving John Lennon, Rory Gallagher, and B.J. Kirkpatrick. Who's B.J. Kirkpatrick, you might ask? Well, he's the Memphis patrolman that arrived at Graceland in the middle of the night on November 23rd, 1976, to arrest Jerry Lee for brandishing a .38 caliber pistol outside of Elvis's home, demanding to see the king right away. Okay, so maybe I fudged things a little bit when I said that the movie was inaccurate by implying there was some resentment between the king. Just that it wasn't how it is in the movie necessarily.
It was a ruse, a ploy, a plot.